Perhaps you've heard of the Yakuza, the poison fists of the Pacific Rim? The Japanese mafia?
They'll kill you 5 times before you hit the ground.
Yakuza, a name associated with the dark glamour of organized crime. And because here in the West, we have this sort of Orientalist, mysticization of Japanese culture, there's a sort of mystery and mystique around the Yakuza. But when I did my research to find out more about the Yakuza, I found myself very intrigued by this intersection of a bunch of different places within current Japanese culture. And also it shows an interesting thing about why organized crime exists and where it comes from. So let's dig in, let's demystify the Yakuza. But first, let's talk about this video's sponsor, Bokksu. I did my last spot in a video last month, and Bokksu was so happy with the ad and your response to it that they came back to do another one. Even though it feels like there's been like 10 years this month, it's a new year. And that means there's a whole bunch of new horizons to learn new things about the world. Bokksu is a Japanese snack company where they send you a little orange box that is packed with snacks that come from Japan. If you become a new subscriber, they send you a Seasons of Japan box, which I have a link to a video I made where I went through one of those. I unboxed one of the boxes in my last video. But basically it's a taste of all of the different snacks they have through the different seasons. Repeat customers get a new themed box every single month. Bokksu recently sent me a Valentine's Day theme for February, and I gotta say, there's some pretty tasty snacks in there. As somebody who has a strong interest in other cultures and learning about them, usually through like very personal human things like snacks, I always try to check out what's going on in convenience stores or random places when I'm traveling. And I've never had the chance to go to Japan. And so this was a glimpse into a food culture that I had never experienced before. And with the culture guide, I've learned a lot about different regions of Japan and a lot about their culinary tradition. I think that if you are interested in Step Back, you're probably interested in other cultures and about the world in general. So this is a great place to just explore a corner of it you might not have been able to explore before. Hey, that rhymes. One of my favorite things about Bokksu is that it shows a strong respect for Japanese heritage and works with artisanal creators to give you something really authentic. Like getting regional snacks from places like Hokkaido, as an example, is really, really cool. So if you want to give it a try, and I actually got a code for a pretty generous discount, there is a code in the description and in the top comment. I would highly recommend you check it out. It would be a great gift, especially with Valentine's Day coming up. Hi, I'm Tristan, this is Step Back History. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notifications to never miss another Step Back video. So the history of the Yakuza goes back quite a long way to a few social castes within 18th century Japanese society during the Tokugawa shogunate. Famously, the Yakuza come from 2 social castes of that period, the Bakuto and the Takiya. The Bakuto were basically gambling organizers. Gambling was illegal, and so they were outlaws, and what they did would be to travel around Japan and facilitate different gambling operations. Many times they'd be operating outside of the law, but sometimes local governments would hire them because they had wage workers who had disposable income and the government wanted to get some of that back. So for a cut of the profits, the government would allow for gambling operations to set up. Their business was pretty good, so on top of gambling, they also got into loan sharking, which is basically very predatory loans, like criminally predatory. But what's really important about the Bakuto is that the aesthetic of the Yakuza largely comes from this period and these people. Bakuto would have full body tattoos, which have become iconic for Yakuza members in Japan today, as well the name Yakuza that I am saying. Apparently, to have a bad hand in cards, you would say Yakuza, which over time started to become generally a term for gangster. There's no organization called the Yakuza. It's sort of like saying the mafia. It is a type of organization that represents a bunch of different families, but Yakuza in Japan is synonymous with the word gangster. The other group that would make up the Yakuza were called the Takiya, which in this period in the 18th century were sort of a caste of traveling merchants. You know, they'd travel to different towns and festivals and set up portable shops and sell different wares. Over time, the Takiya would grow an internal structure that had bosses and hierarchies and levels, and this structure is what would eventually become the social structure of the Yakuza today. They weren't organized crime per se. The business they would conduct, you know, their little stalls were perfectly legal, but they did run protection rackets, which is sort of like a criminal version of, you know, hired security. Also, because they would travel a lot, they attracted a lot of criminals and fugitives who would join their ranks. The closest equivalent in like America would probably be something like carnies. Now, they've been around for a long time, but during the 18th century, which is called the Edo period, they were given official recognition as a caste in society, which over the years would translate to the fact that the Yakuza today still have an air of legitimacy about them. As both these groups started to grow into different illicit businesses, they started to mesh their organizations together in a very interesting way. And eventually, you know, as centuries passed, their rituals and norms and organizational structure would just become one. And Yakuza would be a sort of hybrid of these different ways of life. Now, one of the most iconic things about the Yakuza is that they cover themselves in full body tattoos. The only places that aren't tattooed usually are places that are unable to be covered by wearing long sleeve shirts. So yeah, everything from the wrists and down, including the dong, were all tattooed. And this is probably why tattoos in general in Japan are fairly taboo. And there are places like public bathhouses where you're not allowed in if you have tattoos. And these are not modern tattoos done with like needle guns. These are hardcore, old school tattoos done with needles made of metal or bamboo by hand. That means that these tattoos are much more time intensive to do and much more painful. And as I mentioned, most of the time, they keep these tattoos completely under wraps. They wear long sleeve shirts, they do not tattoo their hands or their face, and so they'd be none the wiser. The only place where they can actually show off their tattoo is when they're in a safe location together. Traditionally, they would take off their shirts when they're playing a game like Ochokabu, which is a card game. And that's where all of the work that they get done is put on display. Another common practice of the Yakuza is something called yubitsume, which is a sort of penitive practice where they cut off fingers in order to get even with somebody. The idea behind it is that they would cut off fingers from the sword hand, starting with the pinky, because when you're holding a sword, the stability of your grip would be based on, you know, your fingers. So you cut off one, your grip is going to get lowered. You cut off two, gets weaker. And basically, as the fingers get cut off, your sword hand becomes weak to the point where you can no longer fight on your own, and you have to depend more and more on the umbrella organization to keep you safe. So basically, if you can't be trusted with independence, they start taking it away, one finger at a time. Now, of course, if you're part of a criminal organization and you're covered in tattoos and you're missing fingers, these are pretty easy visible markers that police could then pick up on. So they've started to either stop this practice. They no longer cut off fingers as a way to sort of make even. But those who still do will actually start wearing prosthetic fingers just so that they're not, you know, clocked from a distance. So that's sort of their rituals, but the things they get up to are actually quite diverse. Like the mafia, you know, here in the West, they don't necessarily only participate in crime. They actually do a lot of legitimate business as well. You know, they're a bunch of legitimate business guys. Very often they're deeply rooted in certain communities, and they've been known to participate specifically in disaster relief efforts. Japan gets a lot of earthquakes, so they typically will help out in those kinds of situations. In their local communities, they also stop crime. And so to some people, they've developed quite a nice reputation, although in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a bunch of really big turf wars, which led to a lot of random violence. So this goodwill towards the Yakuza has diminished quite a bit in the last few decades. As well, they have a connection in the greatest crime of all, politics. Yakuza have pretty strong connections to the Japanese far right, which I don't think I have time to get into in this video, but I feel like could be a pretty good video if, you know, Baksu comes back for round 3. And of course, they participate in other criminal types of activities, such as real estate speculation and investing in the stock market. Japan had a massive housing bubble in the 1980s, and when that collapsed, there were assassinations associated with this real estate bubble bursting. And as part of their real estate and investment schemes, they also have pretty strong connections to major banking institutions. But aside from legal crimes, they also do a lot of illegal crimes. Plenty of them trade in drugs, especially meth, though several large families in the Yakuza actually officially forbid the trafficking of drugs. What they do commonly do is human trafficking, especially with people from the Philippines, bringing them to Japan for sex trafficking. And they also do this very uniquely Japanese form of blackmail called sakaya. What they do is they buy a small amount of shares from a corporation, and then at the annual shareholders meeting, they threaten somebody that they're gonna show up and expose a whole bunch of embarrassing stuff about them in front of all of the shareholders unless they pay them. And one thing they notably don't participate in is theft, at least officially. They have a policy that the Yakuza organizations must be open, or at least partially open to the public. So things like petty theft feel like they're, subversive and secretive, and so they have considered it not part of their usual repertoire of activities, though. I'm sure it's happened at some point. And while the Yakuza primarily operate in Japan, they also have other places where they have set up organizations, specifically in Southeast Asia and in the United States. In the United States, they primarily operate out of Hawaii, but they use their base in America to exchange meth to Americans in exchange for guns. As well, they engage in money laundering operations and oftentimes collaborate with other Asian gangs, such as the Chinese Triads, which, if this video does well, maybe I'll do a video about them too. And all over Southeast Asia, they are operating, especially in the sex tourism industry. There's even been some evidence that Yakuza were operating in North Korea, which is quite interesting. I have so much more to learn about that country. The inside of a typical Yakuza operation operates through an old hierarchical structure called Oibun Kobun. It's based on an ancient Shinto sake sharing ceremony in which somebody who shares with another person has a sort of master and apprentice relationship. So who has shared with who creates a sort of pyramid hierarchical structure, and you can kind of map out how it works through that. This sake sharing ceremony is like somewhere between a swearing of allegiance and a sort of adoption into a sort of foster-parent relationship. Each family is run by a leader called an oyabun, and it's based on a common relationship that shows up in a lot of traditional Japanese organizations called a senpai-kohai relationship. There's a senior called a senpai and a kohai, which is sort of like a junior. The Yakuza are almost exclusively male and refer to each other based on their, place in the hierarchy as younger or older brothers. And while it's got a large overarching structure, it's not all, centralized. Many of the underlings might be running operations of their own and report to people higher up on the chain. And even though they do a lot of criminal activity, a lot of violence, they still have a code of honor. This is called ninkyo. Whether they actually follow it is, they're an organized crime organization that participates in a lot of human trafficking. So their idea of saying that they do no harm, for example, is rather shallow to me, but it is what it is. It exists. For a criminal organization, having a code of honor that values duty and justice and doing no harm feels kind of ironic. The Yakuza organize themselves into syndicates, which is not a term for a union. It means a term for a group of people in a similar industry or something like that working towards shared business goals. The largest of these syndicates is the Yamaguchi-gumi family, which, if you've heard of any Yakuza organization, you've probably heard of the Yachigumi-gumi. They are the most responsible for the expansion of the Yakuza outside of Japan, especially to the United States and Southeast Asia. And this family to this day is led by the venerable 79-year-old Kenichi Shinoda, who actually had his birthday in the space between when I filmed this and when the video came out. So happy birthday! And this globe-spanning criminal operations based out of their headquarters, which is in the city of Kobe. And just like organized crime, the Japanese government's doing everything it can to try and infiltrate and take it down. There are dedicated Yakuza departments of police operations, try and dismantle the organization as many ways as they can. The Yakuza tend to recruit school-aged boys. Typically, they recruit from the ethnic Korean community or from any of the, poor, lower-class people in Japan. Just like in the past, they became a place where the downtrodden and those who really don't have prospects outside of crime turn to in order to have a better life. For example, there's a caste called the Murakumen, who traditionally were kind of like the untouchables. They did jobs that were considered gross or ritually unclean, like butchery or leather making or things like that. And if you know a little bit about Shinto, I made a video about Shinto if you want to check it out. There's a high emphasis on ritual cleansing and cleanliness. You can imagine why this caste exists. It's not officially allowed to discriminate against them anymore, but they do still face discrimination in Japan today. But yeah, ostensibly for an organization that does human trafficking, drug trade, and commits violence, they still have an air of legitimacy about them in Japan. And there's quite a bit of roots that they've dug into local communities. So in a lot of places in Japan, when they have traditional festivals and things like that, the Yakuza will have unofficial place in it where they'll participate in parades and things like that with their shirts off, showing off their full body tattoos, which is a really, really taboo thing. And just like the mafia here in Japan, there's sort of a cultural fascination with Yakuza, what happens in their ranks and things like that. And because they consider themselves the outcasts or, the neglected by society, they do try to help, especially in things like disaster relief, because they feel like it's their obligation, knowing that they have the experience of being people who, the government didn't come and help with. So they have to come in to do something. And that's what I think is one of the important things about organized crime. When you look at it in history, you always notice that it is primarily made up of the outcasts, the people who have been rejected and discriminated against. They are a sign of the inequality of the world we live in. What's also interesting about the Yakuza is that in many ways, like the mafia, they are old enough that they predate the modern, large, overarching state. Groups like the Yakuza existed in a time when governments were a lot smaller and they didn't do a lot of the social programs that exist today. And so as governments became more official and large and overarching, anybody who was outside of the state's activities would be considered criminals. And then that follows that if they are criminal organizations, the only operations that they're going to be able to engage in is criminal stuff. I'm not in any way trying to rehabilitate the Yakuza. The things they do are pretty horrible. But it's interesting how these organizations, like the Yakuza, like the Mafia, exist as sort of relics of a previous age that we don't really see today. A time before big governments. And while I don't have some large statement about society or why capitalism is bad to finish this off, I just thought it was really cool. And I think I'm still allowed to make videos like that, right? Right?